You know, of course, the United States can't allow China to dominate East Asia and can't allow Russia to dominate Europe. What about Russia's domination of the post-Soviet space? Usually the US accuses Russia of the intent to dominate post-Soviet space, to rebuild an empire, and so on. And historically, at least in the 20th century, the US perception was that Russian domination of the post-Soviet space is a threat to the United States because it creates an independent power center. But today, China, as you rightly say, has emerged as a real rival to the United States. So what about the US perception of Russian domination of the post-Soviet space? Can it change towards a more neutral one?
What's very interesting is before the Ukraine crisis broke out, really on February 22nd, 2014, that's when you had the coup against Yanukovych. Before then, nobody in the West was arguing that Russia was a threat to conquer territory in its western border, on its western borders. Nobody was arguing that Russia was going to invade Ukraine or invade the Baltic states. And in fact, if anybody was, in a sense, increasing its influence in those areas that were once controlled by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, it was the United States and its European allies. In 1999, you had NATO, the first tranche of NATO expansion. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic became part of NATO. In 2004, the Baltic states, which border Russia, right, Bulgaria, Romania, so forth and so on, they became part of NATO. The EU also began to expand. So it was not the Russians who were moving westward, it was the West that was moving eastward.
Yeah. And in 2008, NATO claimed that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO.
That was the big mistake that the West made. It was a bridge too far, right? And that was what precipitated, that's the main precipitating cause. Let me put it differently. That's the deep cause of the present crisis, right? Because the Russians were not going to let that happen. And from a Russian point of view, it makes perfect sense. I don't know what the Americans were thinking or what the West Europeans were thinking when they thought that they could drive NATO right up to include Georgia and Russia. That was a huge mistake. But again, I want to emphasize to you that when the United States and the West Europeans were talking about expanding NATO to include Georgia and Russia, they were not doing it because they thought that Russia had to be contained. They did not think that Putin was highly aggressive and that the Russian military was poised to conquer territory in Eastern Europe. In fact, the Russians had remarkably few military units in the Western military districts that could have conquered territory, right? It was after the crisis broke out on February 22nd, 2014, after the crisis broke out, that all of a sudden everybody started arguing that Putin was determined to recreate the Soviet Union or create a greater Russia, and people were beginning to allude to the fact that he looked like Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. This, of course, is ridiculous. What Putin was mainly doing was defensive, it was defensively oriented. He was making sure that NATO did not include Georgia, the war, August 2008, and Ukraine after February 2014. So I don't think there's any real potential for Russia to reconquer territory in Eastern Europe. And by the way, if the Russians try to reconquer territory in Eastern Europe, it's going to be like going into Afghanistan or going into Iraq. If you really want to wreck Russia, I'd say this in the United States, if you really want to wreck Russia, encourage it to try and conquer territory in Eastern Europe. See how well that works out. You've seen how well the United States has done in Afghanistan. You've seen how well we've done in Iraq. That's what happens when you occupy countries in the age of nationalism. You get yourself into big trouble.
Just to finish the topic with Russia-Western relations, let me quote a realist practitioner in the United States, namely Thomas Graham, the former Russia advisor to George W. Bush, who claimed in his latest article in Foreign Policy magazine that the tragedy of the US politics towards Russia is that American establishment has only two options acceptable in terms of their relations with Russia. Option number one is Russia's full integration into the West as a regional power, as a junior power, and option two is complete defeat or final defeat of Russia. And of course, none of the options is acceptable for us. And the model of thinking that you just described in China, that hegemonic stability theory is not applicable to U.S.-Chinese relations, it is also not applicable to Russian-Chinese relations. But before moving to the questions from the audience, let me ask you one last question on the regional politics, of course, with global repercussions, and namely regional politics and regional situation in the Middle East. I know you are also giving one of your lectures in GIMO is about the future in the broader Middle East. And in our perception, we are just in the beginning of a pervasive destabilization there. What's your take? What is the future of the Middle East? And can great powers like the US, Europeans, Russia, China contribute to stabilization of the situation there, also taking into account the tragedy of great power politics and competition among them?
Well, this is an enormously complicated subject because the Middle East is a variety of different countries, and it's very hard to sort of generalize. I think if you look at America's performance in the Middle East since 2001, and of course the United States has focused its foreign policy on the Middle East since 2001, we have certainly not contributed to peace and prosperity. In fact, what we've done is helped create a huge amount of death and destruction. If you look at what we did to Iraq, if you look at the role we've played in breaking apart Syria, if you look at what happened in Libya, if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, it is a pretty sad record. The United States has not been very successful. Now, one could argue that the United States could have done it differently and been more successful. I actually think that's not true. I think that if the United States or Russia or China want to get deeply involved in the Middle East and they want to make things better and they want to promote stability, basically you end up doing social engineering. And social engineering, in my opinion, leads to untold trouble. I think if you're the United States, the best thing to do is stay out of the Middle East. Let people there figure out for themselves how to run their politics. And from an American point of view, the main thing is to make sure that no one country controls all of the oil. That's long been America's principal goal in that region of the world. And that should be our main goal. We should keep most of our military forces offshore. We should have a rapid deployment force. If we have to go in for one reason or another, we can go in, take care of the business, and then pull the forces out. But we should not have large numbers of American troops in the Middle East. We should not pursue anything like the Bush Doctrine.
Dr. Mearsheimer, now let's turn to the questions from the audience. I'm sure there are, because we're having a really thrilling discussion, and we're having this unique opportunity of having the Living Classics classic with us. Please go ahead. But introduce yourself.
Of course. My name is Nikolai Shevchenko. I'm correspondent for Russia Beyond the Headlines. I have an impression that a lot of people in the United with the United States, as well as people in Russia, are looking for a change of leadership in the United States in the hope that it will fix their relations. So my question would be, to what extent you think U.S.-Russia relations depend on who is in charge in Washington and Moscow, and is it fair enough to hope for a change if the leadership changes? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that leaders matter, but not very much. And I think that whether Putin is the president or Medvedev or whoever, it doesn't matter very much. The Russian foreign policy establishment is going to be deeply opposed to NATO expansion into Ukraine and into Georgia, no matter what. And as you know, Gorbachev and Yeltsin were screaming about NATO expansion in the 1990s. Gorbachev and Yeltsin were opposed to NATO expansion. The idea that there's going to be a Russian leader somewhere down the road who's going to tolerate NATO expansion into Ukraine and Georgia is a pipe dream. I mean, many Americans think that, right? I wrote this very controversial piece on the Ukraine crisis in Foreign Affairs, and in the letters that followed up, Michael McFaul, who had been the ambassador to Moscow, basically blamed it all on Putin. And the idea is that Putin hadn't been president, we wouldn't have had this crisis. And as I said in my response, I thought this is simply wrong. It places much too much emphasis on Putin. Nevertheless, I do believe that you can have a more or less adept or clever leader. I think that Putin is quite adept at conducting foreign policy. He's experienced, he knows what he's doing, he has good instincts, right? And it is possible you could have another person running Russian foreign policy who's not as competent as Putin. And I think the same basic logic applies on the American side. I think whether you get a Republican or a Democrat, it's not going to matter very much, because there's not much difference in the United States between the Republicans and the Democrats on almost all foreign policy issues. I sometimes refer to the Republicans and the Democrats as Tweedledee and Tweedledum, right? They just look a lot alike. Now, you could argue that Trump is unusual. This gets back to our earlier discussion. But the truth is, if Trump were to win, and he's not going to win, but if he were going to win, Trump would be constrained by the foreign policy establishment, by the deep state, by Congress, by the media, in terms of what he could do. And Trump would end up looking not much different than Hillary will end up looking when she replaces Barack Obama. You know, there's a very interesting essay you should all read in the Atlantic Monthly by Jeffrey Goldberg. He interviewed Barack Obama, a series of interviews with Barack Obama. And it's very clear from the interview that Obama thinks that American foreign policy is screwed up in a lot of important ways. And he describes a number of different ways of thinking about how to do foreign policy. But what's interesting is that when Obama actually executed American foreign policy, he didn't do it in a different way. He did it the traditional way. Obama was in an iron cage. He had hardly any maneuver room to execute foreign policy according to his basic instincts, right? He was really limited because he was surrounded by this foreign policy community in Washington that put great constraints on him. And this is reflected in the Goldberg interview. He's basically telling Goldberg how foreign policy should have been conducted by him, not how he actually conducted it, right? So again, if Donald Trump were to win, which I believe is not going to happen, he would behave pretty much the way Hillary will behave, because I think she will be elected, right? So there's not much maneuver room in the American context. And my point to you about the Russian context, there's not much maneuver room there either.
Just a small footnote to what John Mearsheimer just said. There is, I think, something more in McFaul's statement that it's all about Putin than just a wrong analysis. This is an indication that we are in a systemic clash, in a systemic confrontation, because this argument is absolutely the same, is very much similar to the argument that was made by George Kennan in late 1940s in the United States in his article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, that it is the internal nature of the Soviet Union which compels the USSR to behave in a belligerent and aggressive way, and there is no alternative for the US to conduct a containment policy. The same, absolutely the same argument is made by McFaul and others like Ivo Daalder and other American liberal internationalists nowadays in the US, and this is one of the similarities between the Cold War and nowadays.